All right. Hello, everybody. I'm Ian Mason, Director of Operations at FUTO, and I'm here today with Dr. Robin Hanson, economist from George Mason University. And we're going to discuss, one of FUTO's main raison d'etres, censorship online, and why it's there. And I'm comfortable using the term censorship, and I'll define that somewhat and say content moderation that is not related to either compliance with the laws of the United States or other free jurisdictions, or sort of time, place, and manner, or decency standards, but ideologically or politically driven moderation decisions en masse. And before we launch into the discussion itself, I'll just sort of give my own brief history of censorship on the internet, free speech on the internet, and see if it comports with your own, and we can kind of go from there. So obviously, the internet was a huge boon to free speech when it starts. You had a wide variety of different platforms and conversations taking place in chat rooms and forums, and wasn't particularly centralized. There was a lot of different things. Nobody had a great monopoly, which made information very unreliable on the internet, but there was sort of a wild west of information without much ability or interest in moderation on a global scale. And sometime in the late aughts or early teens, it became much more possible as social media became more centralized and the places eyes went online became fewer and fewer. That ability sort of to steer conversations and set ground rules became greater. And then as we moved into the middle teens, that ability was used more and more by fewer and fewer companies to greater and greater effect. Culminating, I would say, in the 2020 election cycle, where you have literally the fourth largest newspaper in the United States, New York Post, effectively being unpersoned or being removed from the discourse for a number of days in the run-up to a presidential election over a story that turned out to be essentially true. Since then, obviously, the biggest development is Elon Musk has purchased Twitter, now X, and things have been reset to some extent. I don't know exactly where we are. I think it's very difficult to say. Obviously, we're coming up to another election. For those of you, I don't know exactly when this is going to be posted, but we are 6 days out from another presidential election as of the time of this recording. And I think it's not obvious where things are, but they're in a very different place than they were 4 years ago.
I think we should just put that in the larger context of everything we know about media regulation and censorship for centuries. So, across the entire world, we certainly know that many kinds of media in the past have been somewhat centralized, say newspapers in cities, publishing houses, and that all through history, governments have leaned a bit on publishers when they didn't like what they said, including newspapers and books, et cetera, going way back. And that the more decentralized and small scale were publishers, the harder it was for governments to repress them. But government also varied in just how hard they tried and how many levers they had. And so there were times, say, in the history of the US when, say, newspapers were relatively free of, say, central regulation, although, say, the main city newspaper in a city might well be concerned about retaliation from the mayor or local government. And again, that's not necessarily mediated by official censorship law if they have other implicit threats. And so, the overall degree of regulation of government regulation of media varies with how centralized, how few and centralized and big are the publishers, how many implicit behind the scenes threats are available, how many public powers directly are available to officially regulate. And then, of course, we can completely set aside government and just say, a large organization that's somewhat stable can be captured by various ideological or other communities and then have agendas because of that, independent of government regulation and censorship. And so that's the basic context in which we find ourselves. In the history of the US, there was a history of, say, books and newspapers being pretty free. And then as soon as we had radio and TV, basically, I believe Roosevelt, I think, did this clever trick where he caused a big problem with radio in order to come in and save it with regulation. That is, there was a precedent in the law that if you had a radio station at a certain place, that you should get to keep transmitting there and other people shouldn't be able to interfere. And he officially declared, well, that rule was no longer true. Anybody could publish at any, broadcast at any frequency they want, which they did, and then they make a big mess. And then he rose in and said, well, let's solve everything with a centralized regulatory regime, which then very much controlled what people could say through the threat of taking away your license. That is, you didn't own it as a property. It was just a temporary gift from the government that they could take away at any time. And that was pretty powerful. And so then it was with the rise of the internet and some coincidences that you suddenly had lots of very small scale publishers possible. But then the rise of social media made larger scale units, which then had more of these powers, right? So as an economist, I'd say, well, sure, you could change government rules to make officially government have less powers, but there are these things governments do behind the scenes. Can you regulate government enough to stop that? That's a question of regulating government. And I don't think it's obvious how much we could regulate government. Obviously, the smaller government was, the fewer its powers, maybe the less it could do that. But we're in a world of pretty big government powers. So I'm worried about that. I think you might be able to, promote the less centralized forms of social media, but what are those exactly? And then the vision that I conceive trying to pursue the most is this idea of middleware, somehow separating the functions of search and feed construction and things like that from the underlying infrastructure, and allowing competition at that middle level, even if you still only have a limited number of base providers. And we did that with other sorts of technologies in the past, like we had with telephones, the concept of a common carrier, and that anybody should be able to use the phones as they wish under uniform conditions, and other kinds of utilities like water, power, electricity, things like that. We've often had rules about some sort of uniform treatment of customers. And the question is, how far could we go with that in social media?
Right. So what you're saying, it kind of brought up two things to me. One is a sort of government-private institution distinction that I don't want to say doesn't carry any weight with me. It's not as strict. To me, something can be censorship even if it is not explicit state action or even influenced by it, although I do understand the unique powers of a government versus a merely very powerful private institution. And what you're saying there, this disaggregation, this middleware concept of separating these things out during that, what I'll call the zenith of online censorship, although we don't know where things go from here. Maybe we go back to there, but that sort of late teens, early 2020s era that was the most strict online regime that I can recall. You had this sort of cascade down the chain. It wasn't merely the network effects of the dominant social media players, but people who did try to take those network effects as given and compete found the next chain down, whether it was hosting services, whether it was search engines. There was sort of an alignment of all of these things around the same. I don't know if you want to call it an ideological pinnacle. There was a concerted effort down the line. Does that sort of a thing happen merely as a consequence of the regulatory scheme we live in, or is there something in merely there being dominant players in one space that make that sort of a thing more likely?
If you're thinking about, say, cancel culture, I would think more about mobs.
Yeah.
I mean, in some sense, all through history, regardless of how decentralized the economy and society was, it was possible to create mobs. And then once you had a mob, you should be afraid of it. And it might have arbitrary powers. And there was just varied in whether we ever had mobs. I mean, back in the old US South, mobs would lynch people. And that wasn't anything to do with centralization of government or centralization of business of any sort. That's just the fact that you can get a mob going. And so recently we've gotten some mobs going. And yeah, so even if there's thousands of internet providers, you can get mobs going to, basically crush any one of them that defies the mob consensus. And that's a different problem. Again, it's such an ancient problem that you have to think of it more in terms of sort of what social norms we've ever used to discourage mobs. And that's not really so much about technology. I have more hopes maybe for technological solutions to, say, social media censorship or, control over feeds, but I don't have a great hope for getting rid of mobs.
You mentioned common carrier regulations. That's, I think, a good. It's not their explicit justification, but in a way, the history of common carrier reasoning, going back to medieval times, even, is a counter to the logic of the mob. That travelers are able to still access services even if there's a commonly held belief that people coming from such and such towns, shouldn't, or so on. Is that the answer then? Is there a area of this whole scheme that, because people have suggested regulating social media companies as perhaps not traditional common carriers, but some common carrier-like distinction. Is there hope in that? Does that realign the incentives? Maybe before I should just ask, is there a failure of the market in general to counter this? Like, is there?
I think you might just want to think in terms of some market structures maybe being healthier and more effective than others. But look, innovation across centuries is us slowly finding better and better structures for lots of things. I don't really want to say that, when invention X appears, that the entire history of the world before that was a market failure because it hadn't invented X yet. That seems a little off. But once you invent X, you can do things better. So I more want to think, can we be creative and think about the different arrangements that are possible, at which ones might be better, even if the less better arrangements might still make for a basically functional world. But can we do better?
Is the aim then of whatever this new technological structure is disaggregation the key there, or is it that equality of access, that a kind of common carrier, like a technologically enforced common carrier logic, or is it more the disaggregation, that separating the different steps along the chain?
Well, again, we've identified at least two problems so far. So it's one problem is just the generic problems of mobs enforcing mob justice. And that goes just way, way back. And that's happened recently on social media, but I'm not sure that social media particularly encouraged it. And then there's this separate problem of highly concentrated social media platforms and networks, which naturally lead to pretty strong centralization. And then the power that centralization has given, the discretion it's given to those who control it, and then the ability of governments and others to take advantage of that discretion to control things. That's more the second problem I might more hope to do. Now, so there's a tradition in economics and antitrust policy, even more generally, of being wary of certain kinds of tying. So if I'm a monopolist on one product, what I might want to do is make you buy not that just product, but a bunch of other products too as a package. So now I can be a monopolist over more stuff. And so then we often might wonder maybe to force you to separate things, where you might have strong market power on one thing, but that we don't necessarily want that to lead to strong market power on other potentially connectable things that don't necessarily have to be connected. So then one way to thinking about social media is to think about how many different products and services are there in a social network, and then could they be pulled apart so that these main companies don't have to necessarily provide all of them. Now, that's been an issue, say, even from long ago with Microsoft or Google. For these suppliers, you get this package of products and services, or Apple, and many wondered, should all those things be in that package? And they have tried to push back, but it's complicated because, in fact, they are doing a fair bit of innovation in rearranging the package and creating and using interdependencies between the features of the package, and we're getting substantial value out of them managing a package. So you don't want to break apart packages of things you get from customers arbitrarily or too easily. So a standard example, say, is that cable companies and services today sell you packages of movies and TV shows.
Mhm.
And you might think, well, let's just make them sell these individually. And it turns out you would just pay a lot more for them individually because of a certain kind of price discrimination that becomes possible with packaging, which is in the customer's and the business's interest. So we don't want to force them to sell you each movie and TV show a la carte. We see advantages of the packages. So that's a question we will get to the social media. First, try to imagine a way to separate it, and then try to wonder how many kinds of value we'll be losing if we do force that separation, because we will freeze some things in. Anytime you make an interface, you see, between two parts of the system that then can evolve separately with that interface, you lock in the interface. And the question, are we ready to lock in interfaces here on social media, or are we still in too early the days? As you might know, for the telephones, once telephones got very established and standardized, that's when we regulated telephones and said, okay, we're going to require interconnection, require a common carrier. But there was an early period where it was just in flux. And we didn't really know what telephones would look like. And maybe it wouldn't have been a good idea to lock in regulations at that point.
So in the social media context, I mean, social media, as we know, it's been around for long enough now that I think we can have some sort of neutral historical examples. So I'll maybe ask you for a couple. In those, in that bundling and that aggregation of services into what we now know as social media, can you think of one that's genuine, increases consumer welfare, is a legitimate thing, and which is sort of more disingenuous? Maybe the second would be a little more difficult. Can you think of an example of either, just to?
I guess, a thing that can be separated is what we call skins from any application, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I use Twitter as my most, popular use application. And for some reason, every time I log out of Twitter, log back in, it forces me to have a black background on everything. And I have to go into the menu and find the display setting and set it to a white background again. It's apparently somebody in there really wants us to have black backgrounds. It's just a thing. But clearly, it shouldn't be that hard. And of course, partly what they're doing is to let you choose your own skins, so that be something that you choose for the overall arrangement. But again, the usual thing is that they give you a menu of those things, but they choose the menu because redesigning the interface would redesign what the options are. And sort of setting that in by law wouldn't work very well, because then you'd be setting in sort of the basic structure of the interface, which wouldn't let them change it anymore. But you can see how at least that would be. Now, the thing that people, I think, focus on, which does make sense, which is basically the feed. So like the center thing, like if you imagine anybody can post anything they want, etc., the main question is, yeah, but what do you see when you go looking? And that's this algorithm that goes and looks at things and what you've seen before and scores it for you. And that's the thing that gives them this huge power. They can highlight, they can delete things from the feed or promote or demote things in the feed. And that's the thing you might most want to think, could we somehow separate out the function of the feed? And then the usual image is, well, you let there be competing feed makers who you could subscribe to, maybe for a little fee, and they get access to the underlying database and access to some computing algorithms that they can use, and then they choose different feeds for you. And then now the organization doesn't choose the feeds, you choose feeds from competing suppliers. And that's an attractive vision, but it has these questions about, can you define a stable interface that doesn't limit innovation too much?
I think one of the challenges, several different product lines, here at FUTO, is those are things that we're trying to get to. I think that's sort of the central logic of what a lot of the things we are to do. So let me ask just about the incentives of the censorship itself, because I think this is similar to that sort of genuine consumer welfare increasing bundling story versus more sort of disingenuous ones. Is the economic logic of censorship, or as they would say, of moderation. If you talk to any of the giants, or at least back when they could get away with this more easily, talk to any of the tech giants about why they have the moderation or had the moderation policies that they did, they would say it was economically necessary. That people demand this, that it's unusable without it, that their advertisers would pull out if they did not. And I mean, I have my own ideas about this sort of advertiser boycott theory, which is almost always driven from the opposite end that people that they suggest it was. Their story would be that, well, the consumers themselves are so upset that the ads are being displayed next to content they find objectionable that they themselves will boycott products involved. And I'm unaware of any serious example of that happening, but I can think of the opposite happening many times.
Again, I think we should just go to the largest background theoretical cases we can, which don't have to be social media as a basis. So that we just have this basic distinction in economic and marketing between niche products and mass market products. And mass market products are just trying to appeal to most everybody. And so they deem to be kind of bland and unoffensive to do so. And then niche products can very much offend lots of people as long as a few people like them. That works fine. And often to make a successful niche product, you want to create the idea that other people don't like this and only you special people like this. And that's why we special people who like this are a community that needs to stick together with our special favorite product here that defines how we're different from other people, right? But mass market products are very sensitive to offending substantial fractions of the population, and they're going to typically be very milquetoast and not offend. And so we saw that, say, in the early TV channels, not just because they had regulation, but say maybe the major movie studios, say when there were a small number of dominating movie studios and chains, might see it and say, so even Pepsi and Coke, et cetera. And that's often a problem. That is, if they're too milquetoast, they're boring and people don't want to buy them. So things like Pepsi and Coke are always trying to seem spicy and with it and risky without actually bothering anybody. And so
right. Safe edgy, I think, is the
right. So, and so then obviously social media is going to feel similar. And clearly the content on social media is in fact more capable of offending people.
Oh, certainly. I guess I only mean that, pre-Elon Twitter or Facebook or these will justify their decision to ban a broad category of content with the logic that if we don't, and these are only hypothetical. I mean, these aren't hypothetical. These things did happen, but I'm just using random companies and names here. With the logic that if they do not, or they'll at least justify their actions, saying that if they don't take these actions, BMW will not advertise with them, and that BMW's decision will be based on the idea that people will not buy cars from companies that they know to advertise on social media platforms that allow content that they find objectionable. And in my own personal experience, I mean, this is only anecdotal, I am unaware of any one person, let alone an organized body of consumers, not purchasing BMWs because they advertised on Facebook at the same time that a racist was speaking on Facebook.
You've probably heard this old saying, "No one ever got fired for buying IBM."
Right.
Right. Now it's not like there was it was shameful to buy something that wasn't IBM. Not there was a big campaign that you would be thrown out. It was just in a world of risky choices, there's often what's seen to be a safe choice, and then that pushes everybody to make the safe choice. And they don't necessarily know how much they're risking if they would not take the safe choice, but they figure, why find out? And when you just see hardly anybody risking anything, everybody taking the safe choice, then you take the safe choice not really knowing what the penalty would be for deviation. And we moderns in the last century often feel very proud that we celebrate nonconformity and difference and exploration and innovation. We contrast ourselves to all these uptight conservative cultures of history. But look, that means that we're claiming to be different than everybody else was in history. Clearly in history, most places and times, people were pretty conservative.
The nail that sticks out gets hammered.
That, yeah. So we just don't know was the point. So I would just say, let's just make sure there's enough competition or potential variety that if people do want something different, then it can be provided. But then, I guess we'll find out if it is.
Of the regulatory efforts that are out there now, do you see any of them? There's been efforts, obviously, by Texas, by Florida, these things to further regulate the social media space in a way that would make it less advantageous for them to censor. Do you see any hope in those? And there's a second aspect of that is the regulatory environment up to this point. I mean, I think personally, I think that people overemphasize its significance, but Section 230, the Communications Decency Act, obviously plays a huge role in the leeway that media platforms have to avoid liability under what more traditional media establishments would have.
In the previous, there were these two models. There were communication things and there were publishers, and publishers were responsible for everything they published. And so if you see social media as a publisher, now they have to moderate everything and be very restrictive. If you see it as a communication mechanism like telephones, I mean, clearly we weren't holding telephone companies responsible for anything anybody said in a telephone call before. And so it's more of a question of which previous model you're using here. Is it individual communication, or
but at the same time, a telephone company could not cancel your service for anything you said over a telephone call.
Exactly. Right. So we had those sorts of restrictions. So I'll have to admit, I don't know what these regulations are. And so maybe for the benefit of our audience, you could review them and then I could react.
They have, I'll take the Texas's law, SB 50 here in Texas, that is now, it creates a private cause of action for being removed from a social media network for a non-viewpoint neutral term of moderation. So a platform's allowed to have any viewpoint neutral things they do, and there's obviously a long jurisprudence for viewpoint neutrality versus something that's to enforce decency or safety or that can be applied without reference to the viewpoint of the speaker. And it's difficult, and obviously things are still tied up in the court there. Do you see, does that reset the incentive? I'll just ask from an economic perspective, does that reset the incentives of the of the social media giants to censor, or is the mob logic still going to be stronger? I mean, is this an easy thing to put a finger on the scale and it will stop, or?
Well, there's all these other choices they have besides canceling you. Right. So they can just downgrade your contributions to the feed. They can, maybe give you fewer other features. They could maybe sort of hold a particular thing in moderation for a while. I mean, if we're only having a cause of action about taking you off the site, that seems like...
I think it includes those things as well. At least the Texas law does. It includes those things as well. De-ranking or any of those, de-emphasizing. I can it uses about 4 different verbs there.
The viewpoint neutral thing, I might think they censored people for saying things that were against COVID, consensus reality at the time, right? Well, is that viewpoint neutral or not? There are people who have, say the Hunter Biden laptop, they say, well, that's false information. The authorities have said so. Therefore, does that count as viewpoint neutral? I mean, to the extent, much of the problem in the last half decade has been this idea that there are certain authorities that we should defer to. And when they declare something misinformation, it must be moderated away. And the question is, what will authorities' declarations also be considered, viewpoints and therefore not the basis for moderation? That seems hard.
I would think traditionally, anyways, no, that the truth or falsity of a statement is pretty close to the base of a viewpoint. But I think, that's not necessarily that safe doing there. I mean, to me, it opens up to the sort of broader question: is it inherently in the economic interest of a duopoly or an oligopoly of social media companies to have a de facto unified moderation thing, or is it natural for them to compete? Because what has happened, at least historically here, is that they all have. If they are bending to a mob, they've all been to the same mob. There seems to have, if there weren't collusion, they acted as though there were.
Well, I mean, this is honestly how a lot of coordination happens in the world. People are basically don't make independent choices. They look around and see what choices other people are making, and then they typically choose similar things. And that's a sensible choice. That's how we often coordinate on many sorts of things, including, what clothing fashion is in fashion at the moment and everything else. I think there's this basic phenomena that we often see problems in the world, and then we try to invent rules that, if followed, would address the problem. And that approach has some problems of its own that we don't see in the moment of suggesting rules. So one is that rules can be ambiguous and need interpretation. Another is that rules accumulate and then have complex interactions, and that rules often then limit innovation and change. And they give power to whoever is in charge of enforcing the rules. And we do actually, I think, have problems in a world of just accumulating too many rules. And that's just a problem. Lots of industries with regulation, but also within many firms, they just accumulate too many rules, and it's hard to get rid of them. So knowing that, I just want to lean toward a competition solution. I might want to ask, well, how could we make competition healthier, stronger, so that we don't need rules as a solution? We could then trust the competition to answer them. We could say, you don't like this, find a competitor that you like better. And that seems to be, in general, a healthier solution if we can make that work.
So I think that's a perfect segue to where I wanted to wind up with this discussion anyway. After years of looking at this from the framework of what rules can we impose, what rules can we maybe get rid of, what technologies might change things, what technologies could be introduced to the space to make competition more likely, it turned out none of that was as significant as the actions of one man. And of course, I'm referring to Elon Musk buying Twitter. Elon Ex Machina comes in and changes the free speech or the censorship landscape of social media far more than any of those things, years of effort on any of those lines combined. Is this just a black swan? Is there something inherent in the hyper concentration of social media before it happened that made this likely? I mean, so how lucky were we? Is this a fruitful avenue for the future? And if it is, how can this sort of thing be encouraged again? This sort of someone taking a sledgehammer, or something taking a sledgehammer to an ossified oligopoly.
So a century or two ago, the world was decentralized in the sense that there was not a dominant coalition of nations who ran the world. We suffered a lot in terms of conflict and lack of coordination and wars. But there's a sense in which that doesn't suffer other problems. We today are leaning more and more toward an integrated world elite culture, which dominates the richest nations, which makes them act pretty similar. And that has short-term coordination advantages, but then has the risks that they can just lock in a bad approach that it's just hard to challenge. So thankfully, the world isn't entirely controlled by a dominant thing, but we're somewhat at risk of that. And we have various pariah alternatives at various times that defy the global consensus and last for a while, but at least maybe push the global elites to consider alternatives. So I might think of, Musk represents this more competitive solution, which may be on the way out if the world is slowly becoming more and more integrated and more not allowing much deviation. But for now, at least there is a clear alternative there. And honestly, look, if you think about the alternative of a single world government versus competing nations, for a long time, a lot of people have said, we just need this world government. Why don't we have one? That's just the obvious thing to do. And it makes a lot of sense in many ways. But many people have had this intuition. Yeah, but like if we have a single world government, who takes it over? And what happens if that goes wrong? And they'd like some competition there. And similarly, we're certainly in the era now that we can have competition in social media platforms, at least if governments will let them have the freedom to be different. So, for example, it's quite possible that if Harris wins this coming election, that the Harris administration will come down on Twitter with stronger pressures and regulations and defeat Musk's defiance. And already, as you know, like a coalition of elites did cut into his advertising revenue quite a bit by pushing people to not advertise on Twitter as a form of protest or disapproval or whatever it is. So, I mean, he has suffered substantially financially for that choice. So you could see that as a lesson other people will learn not to follow his example. So it's not clear how much this is going to be taken as a positive example here. If I were other investment people wondering whether I could also, like him, defy, the elite consensus to do things my way and say, well, you're going to lose half your capital, then most of them might say no. I mean, maybe the lesson here is really, maybe people didn't really know how much you'd be punished, and now you know. And it's big, and okay, you don't want to do that.
Right. Examples have to be made, yeah.
Right. So often seeing a dramatic, it's the exception that proves the rule, literally, right?
Right.
Sometimes to have everybody see that there is a rule, we need somebody to defy the rule and see what happens to them. And we'll say, okay, there's a rule and this is the consequence.
In any event, it's already been more interesting, and we'll see, depending on when this goes up, we'll have either just seen or we'll see in a few days just how interesting things are. But I think it's definitely a more interesting space than it was a couple of years ago. And obviously at FUTO, we're doing our best to try and make it more interesting ourselves.